Herzlich willkommen zurück zur Ringvorlesung zur Klimakrise. Heute sprechen wir über das Thema Colonialism, Racism, Climate and Justice. Und wir sind sehr froh, dass wir heute Olumide Abimbola bei uns begrüßen dürfen. Gleich zu Beginn möchte ich noch ein paar kurze Ankündigungen machen und ein paar Organisationssachen klären. Und zwar möchte ich noch mal darauf hinweisen, dass der Online-Test um eine Woche verschoben wurde auf den 28.06. Das heißt, er wird nächste Woche Dienstag wie gewohnt starten. Außerdem möchte ich noch eine kleine Ankündigung machen. Einen Moment. So, ich hoffe, ihr könnt mein Bildschirm sehen. Und zwar haben die Students for Future eine Vollversammlung am 29.06. Um 18 Uhr im Audimax organisiert. Und das Ziel der Versammlung ist es, über Forderungen abzustimmen, die an den Uni-Präsidenten gestellt werden sollen, damit die Uni bis 2025 klimaneutral werden kann. Und da die Forderungen bisher noch nicht, oder da es schon mal eine Vollversammlung gab und die Forderungen bis dahin leider noch nicht so weit erfüllt sind, wäre es gut, wenn wir eine möglichst große Reichweite erzielen. Deshalb kommt am besten alle vorbei. Es wird auch Musik geben. Und genau, im Chat findet ihr gleich auch noch einen Link. Da könnt ihr die Forderungen nochmal nachlesen und auch gerne eigene Forderungen stellen oder Kritik äußern. Dann können wir die noch überarbeiten. Genau. Ansonsten haben wir auch noch eine eigene Sache, und zwar wie viele von euch bestimmt bemerkt haben, sind wir sehr bemüht, in der Ringvorlesung die rassistischen und extraktivistischen und kolonialen Strukturen zu thematisieren, mit denen die Klimakrise unmittelbar verbunden ist. Und wir haben oft die Rückmeldung erhalten, dass es ein Bedürfnis nach mehr Austausch gibt und es viele Fragen gibt, die in diesem Webinar-Setting so nicht geklärt werden können. Und deswegen möchten wir eine Teilnahme an Workshops ermöglichen, in denen wir über die Zusammenhänge zwischen Klimakrise und Rassismus diskutieren können. Und das Ganze wird in 2 getrennten Räumen stattfinden, für weiß positionierte Menschen einmal und für rassifizierte oder migrantisierte Menschen. Und die Online-Workshops werden etwa 90 Minuten lang sein. Und pro Workshops können immer 25 Menschen teilnehmen, und die werden am und um den 5. Juli stattfinden. Wir werden in dieser Woche auch nochmal einen Link schicken, in dem ihr die Workshops buchen könnt. Die Teilnahme ist nicht verpflichtend, aber wir legen es euch doch sehr ans Herz und würden uns sehr freuen, wenn möglichst viele von euch daran teilnehmen. Genau, und jetzt würde ich ins Englische switchen, da der Vortrag heute auf Englisch sein wird. So today we want to talk about the connection between the climate crisis and colonialism. And we will also look at the origins of the climate crisis and how it is connected to colonialism, and look at climate justice. I'm very happy to welcome for this lecture Olumide Abimbola, and he is the founder and director of the Africa Policy Research Institute, APRI. It is based in Berlin and is an African think tank set up to provide evidence-based recommendation to German, EU, and African policymakers. His areas of focus include economic informality, trade policy, regional integration, the green transition, and natural resource management. As a PhD student, he founded the Nigerians Talk, a forum of Nigerian opinion and analysis, and the site is made up of a community of writers who focus on all things Nigerian. And he did his PhD at the Max Planck Institute of Social Anthropology in Germany. And we are really happy that you are here today and are really excited for your lecture. And now the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I'm going to share a presentation that I prepared and talk/read through it. Yes. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this lecture series. As you probably know, this wasn't mentioned. I was lead author in a framing paper that was commissioned by Heinrich Böll Foundation. It was published last year on the International Day for the Elimination of Racism. The paper was titled Racism and Climate Injustice, and the paper forms the central part of my lecture today. But before I delve any deeper into the lecture, I want to introduce myself. Catherine already did an excellent job, but let me sort of introduce how I came to start thinking much more seriously and actively about climate change. So my name is Olumide Abimbola, as you've heard. I was born and grew up in Nigeria. I did my undergraduate studies at the University of Ibadan, where I read the works of post-colonial theorists like Tris Spivak. My undergraduate degree was in, sort of a liberal arts undergraduate degree. My major was in communication studies, but I took classes in philosophy, literature, and linguistics. After my undergraduate studies, I went to Sweden to study development at the Uppsala University. As a Nigerian middle-class kid in his early 20s, in the mid-2000s, I wanted to understand how to develop Nigeria in particular, but of course other African countries as well. I could not then think of a better place to study development than in Scandinavia, where I had read and seen in movies. It looked like they had it all under control. As I was preparing, the talk today, I wondered whether if it were today, if I were picking something to study today, whether I would not have chosen to study something around climate change instead of development. Because the urgency that I felt then was regarding development, but the urgency I feel now is regarding climate change. And I don't think I need to mention to this group how much of an existential crisis it is. I quickly got disillusioned about development during my master's days. For one, no one really had a clear definition of development for us. We learned all the theories, but it felt like there were so many exceptions to the theories that they just appeared useless. And second, I felt that whatever development was had to be local and very context bound. So I went and did a PhD in anthropology. I did it here, here in Germany at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle. My PhD work was on the trade in second-hand clothing from Europe to West Africa. So it was during my PhD days that I first started thinking about climate change, but not really actively. Because one of the reasons that the European Commission gave for legislating against having textile, go into landfills in Europe was because of climate change. So the idea was that European clothes should not go into landfills because climate change was happening, right? Instead, the clothing should be sold, should be recycled and sold, often abroad, and mostly to the global south, and quite a lot to Africa. So I was following the Africa part. But then, of course, what this means is that Europe manages to keep clothing out of its landfills, knowing that the clothing will end up in landfills outside of European shores. So this pattern of exporting Europe's waste has been seen in other areas as well. I mean, this includes electric waste, so electronics, also toxic chemical waste. But back to my story. So after my PhD, I went to work for the African Development Bank on trade and regional integration. And after that, for the GIZ on natural resources management. So it was when I was working on natural resources management at the GIZ that I actually turned with more seriousness to look at climate change. And once I started looking, I could not stop. I felt scandalized at how bad the situation was, especially in the global south. I felt depressed by the hypocrisy of the global north, and I was alarmed by how much still had to be done, right? I sort of describe myself as having now the zeal of a new convert. And because I just wonder why not everything we're doing and studying right now, why is that not about climate change? Why are we not just thinking about it and trying to adapt to it and fix it? So when the opportunity came to write the framing paper on racism and climate change, I eagerly agreed to work on it because I thought it would be a way for me to join others in thinking through why things are as bad as they are and why the world is not doing enough about it. So like I said, the paper on racism and climate injustice was one of my ways of thinking through the issues. As I mentioned already, the talk is based on the paper. So here is what I will be going through today. First, I will go through the arguments about how colonialism and racism contributed to creating climate change. In doing this, I will discuss some past events that clearly underscore the arguments regarding the connection between colonialism and climate change. Second, I will examine how colonialism and racism have shaped climate policy. I will then look at how indigenous peoples and other racialized communities around the world, both in the global south as well as in communities of the global north, how they are disproportionately impacted by climate change. And then I will close by sharing some thoughts on how racism in climate policy and action could be addressed. I'm hoping the talk will last about 50 minutes or so. I will try to speak slowly because I have the tendency of speaking very fast. So let's get into it. I mean, how have how have colonialism and racism contributed to climate change? Well, so if we recast the first anthropogenic change in global temperatures as a result of the first wave of colonization, we begin to see the interwovenness of racism and climate change. Racism, as it operates today, which I think you all know, has a complex history. Part of it is the context of mass violence during colonization of the Americas. We had the genocides, the dispossession, enslavement of indigenous peoples of the Americas, and then soon afterwards of Africa. These were the building blocks of racist theories and practices. Indeed, the genocides in the Americas, the mass enslavement and importation of Africans to the American colonies constituted the largest population replacement in the millennia. Add to this the introduction of plants and animals to the colonized locations, leading to large-scale irreversible ecological transformations, and the picture of how colonialism contributed to climate change begins to emerge. In fact, anthropogenic climate change and racism both emerged during the conquest of the Americas, and scholars have argued that the reason this happened is tied to what is termed as the conquering ego. So, from a decolonial perspective, the construction of the conquering to justify and normalize genocidal violence on an unprecedented scale emerged during the first wave of colonization of what was to become Latin America. Scholars have shown that Descartes' I think, therefore I am, was preceded by I conquer, therefore I am. They have also argued that the ego conquiro of, I conquer, therefore I am, made possible the Cartesian ego, and that in fact the conquering ego laid the foundation for the Cartesian ego of modern Western thought. So the Cartesian view of the world is what has been suggested underpins the exploitation of natural resources and a long-term disregard for what is called externalities by economists. It has normalized an instrumental view of nature and renders climate injustice invisible by obscuring culpability and responsibility for emissions and other climate harms. So long-standing hierarchies between white and BIPOC men, women, culture, nature, which have become institutionalized globally since the colonial era, also explain why BIPOC women and non-binary people continue to experience heightened vulnerability generally, and especially in relation to the climate crisis. Such hierarchies have a significant impact on access to resources and various forms of capital, which are a major determinant of socioeconomic opportunities for individuals and population groups within countries. So in turn, access to socioeconomic opportunities play a critical part in the ability of population groups and individuals to cope with and recover from climate change impacts today. So according to sort of this perspective, the transformation of human-nature relationships from embeddedness, which we still have in many societies and communities today, to domination, which is kind of the dominant way of thinking about it now, and the establishment of the non-white other and women as part of nature belong to the same dynamic. So now, after setting the scene by showing how racism and colonialism sort of set the stage for the climate crisis, let's have a quick look at the concept that is used to define the current times we live in, the Anthropocene. It means the new age, so scene, of man, anthropos, and it is used to mark the geological age in which human beings have been impacting the climate system in ways that are being recorded in sediments now. So, but I think there are a few problems with this, and others have sort of joined as well to point this out. First of all, the concept assumes that the white male is the epitome of the human. The concept also universalizes the polluting behavior of the global north and its related system as being central to a global human condition. And thirdly, the concept blurs both historically differentiated responsibility and unevenly distributed impacts of the climate crisis. So the truth of the matter is this: only a small group of human beings have historically contributed to climate change, while at the same time largely destroying many different indigenous ways of interacting with nature. So some scholars have argued instead of the Anthropocene that it should be better called the racial capitalocene, so which is a way of trying to expose implied relationships to race, capitalism, imperialism, and gender that are part of this specific vision of the Anthropos, because this is not all of the people doing this. So let's go through some events that I think underscores just how much the world has changed. Some might even say ruined by colonialism. So as part of a new imperialism between 1870 and 1914, European countries established formal political, economic, and social control over almost all territories of the world. So by 1914, Europe nominally controlled 84% of the world's land surface, against 35% in 1800. The unrivaled profits of enslavement, followed by violent colonial expansion, fueled the Industrial Revolution by providing European countries with access to raw materials such as oil, rubber, wood, cotton, copper, gold, iron, and cobalt, which were abundant in Africa at very minimal costs. As a result, industrialization and the tripling of international trade between 1878 and 1918 afforded European countries with the power to successfully take and profitably maintain their numerous colonies overseas. Consequently, the Industrial Revolution marks the beginning of a steady rise in global greenhouse emissions, with a sharper turn from the 1910 decade. So this has been documented in various reports by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Although many colonized countries gained independence after the Second World War, scholars argue that the global North's domination of former colonies simply became subtle and insidious. So industrialization is one of the main drivers of anthropogenic climate change. It resulted in an increase in global temperature by over 1 degree between 1880 and 2020. Colonization permitted the unfolding of the climate crisis by facilitating and establishing the global overexploitation of natural resources to fuel industrialization in Europe and the United States, as well as associated land use changes, which have contributed to a steady rise in greenhouse gas emissions. I encourage you to check out the data on that page to see the development over the years and just how much has changed in just a few centuries. So the data on this page is also from the same source from the former slide, and it underscores what's been described as a perverse paradox, in that resources were expropriated from colonized countries and territories in Latin America, Africa, and Asia to fuel industrialization, which would later contribute to the rise of greenhouse gas emissions and trigger climate change impacts that would critically affect formerly colonized countries and territories. right? So this is the paradox. They didn't create this crisis, but they're the ones suffering mostly from it. But not just that, they don't have the resources to respond to the crisis because in part they didn't create the crisis because they weren't the ones that industrialized on the back of the climate to create the crisis. But then upon securing their independence, these societies were frequently forced into forms of development that's, one could say, ill-suited in facilitating sustainable economic development and a flourishing of their population, but which instead delivered or maintained inequality. So consequently, the mapping of the distribution of climate change impacts, as you can see on the slide, follow a pattern clearly marked by colonial continuities. Most countries in the formerly colonized global south can be classified as climate first riders, as they bear the brunt of current and future climate impacts and are particularly vulnerable to such impacts, while having contributed, like I said, minimally to the climate crisis. The vulnerability of these countries and territories to climate change impact is further compounded by the fact that they were pillaged during the colonial era, which left them underdeveloped and with few resources to address climate change impacts. So how have colonialism and racism shaped climate policy and action today? So first of all, we have to say that insufficient and adequate climate action is a blatant illustration of colonial continuities and racism. The inadequacy of climate action from countries in the global north is particularly salient when considering the history of international climate diplomacy, the double standard that exists in climate policy and action that applied today by countries of the global north, and 3, the design and implementation of measures to address the impact of climate change, often in ways that do not align with the objectives of countries in the global south. Some have even argued that the current state of affairs in international climate action is due to the fact that countries in the global north want to maintain their place in the global hierarchy. And I actually don't see any reason why, one would contest that. So let us look at what it looks like now, climate diplomacy internationally. So the long history of international climate policy has unfortunately not resulted in the protection of the most vulnerable people from the impacts of the climate change. So the first global conference on global warming was held in 1988. Shortly afterwards, the UN General Assembly declared climate change as a threat to humankind, and they mandated a multilateral process to address climate change. This led to the UNFCCC, which was established in 1992. The objective then was to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions to levels that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, right? So that ecosystems would be able to adapt naturally, so that food production would not be threatened and economic development could proceed sustainably. I mean, this was part of the objective of the UNFCCC when it was founded. For the first decade of its existence, the UNFCCC focused on mitigation efforts with the hope that the most dangerous impacts of climate change could be avoided. Again, that was sort of how the UNFCCC saw itself. Although the UNFCCC does recognize this historical responsibility of developed countries, the global north countries, for the impacts of climate change, the proposal by small island states who advocated for a mechanism to compensate them for loss and damage incurred as a result of sea level rise was not incorporated into the UNFCCC in its final formulation. But in 2001, it became clear that more focus on adaptation was needed. So the National Adaptation Programs of Action, NAPAs, were established to help least developed countries identify their most urgent adaptation priorities, right? So it was just to identify them. At COP8 in late 2002, the Delhi Declaration was issued by several global South countries to highlight adaptation as a priority and demand more support to reduce vulnerability and adapt to the impact of climate change. Nevertheless, developed countries promoted a global temperature goal of 2 degrees at COP15, even with the knowledge that this magnitude of warming would have catastrophic impacts for many countries in the global south. I mean, we have not hit that yet, and we're already seeing the effects in countries in the global south right now. So in 2010, when it became clear that neither mitigation nor adaptation levels were insufficient to avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change, a work program was created to better understand approaches to address loss and damage. In 2013, the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage was established to promote approaches to address loss and damage, in vulnerable countries, building on the work done by the Alliance of Small Island States. Global South countries have long called for support to address climate change impacts, for which they are, as already mentioned, both least responsible for and to which they are most vulnerable to. Yet, concrete action has been inadequate till now. In all of this, it is hard not to see the continuity of exploitation and disregard for the rights of others that characterized colonial relations. So current global average temperature has already increased by over 1 degree compared to pre-industrial levels. And scientists are projecting the world is moving towards a 2.6 degree global average warming by the end of the century, if current post-COP26 short-term pledges made by countries and climate policies are implemented. This is occurring despite a commitment in the Paris Agreement to keep warming well below 2 degrees and to make a concerted effort to limit warming to 1.5 degree. The focus on 2 degree rather than 1.5 degree as the preeminent global temperature goal has been characterized as carbon capitalism, highlighting that the global community agreed to a global temperature a limit that is untenable for many countries in the global south. Moreover, the Paris Agreement does not provide a roadmap for how to limit warming to 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees. Some have argued that the Paris Agreement let developed countries off the hook for their massive contributions to historical emissions, but increased pressure on developing countries and left vulnerable developing countries even more exposed to climate change impacts that are increasing in both magnitude and frequency. I don't need to go into the details of just how frequent adverse weather events have been in, on the continent in Africa, for example. So it was not until the impacts of climate change began to manifest within global north territories that political leaders in the global north declared climate emergencies. Though several countries in the global north have declared national climate emergencies, the financial commitments they have made are not commensurate with the urgencies of the climate crisis. Let's take the UK, for example. The UK declared a national climate emergency in May of 2019. Yet, the country reduced official development assistance, ODA, to 0.5% of GDP in late 2020, at a time when vulnerable countries needed more finance, more than ever, to address some of the determinants of vulnerability to climate change. Some of this include access to healthcare, social protection, and economic opportunities. So, where are the global South experiences in global climate diplomacy? This is really important because it's, if there's no data, people kind of don't act. And of course, lack of data is often blamed for the failure to adequately assess how climate impacts and risks are experienced in developing countries, because there really is truly significant lack of information. But this is due to the fact that production of knowledge is dominated by perspectives from the global north. to now. Also, much higher investment in the global north has made larger the divide in climate science between global south and global north. So, the lack of investment in technology and infrastructure in the global south is part of a vicious cycle in which a lack of climate data and information on the impacts of climate change in the global south is then used to justify delayed or inadequate climate action. So let's talk money, climate finance. So despite the urgent need, the global north countries have not met their commitments to provide $100 billion a year to support, by 2020, to support both mitigation and adaptation measures as agreed in the negotiation process under the UNFCCC. A recent report from the OECD maintained that in 2017 to 2018, $59.5 billion in public finance was provided to developing countries. However, in a shadow report by Oxfam, it's argued that the net support provided to developing countries in 2017 and 2018, so the actual period, was actually between 19 and 22.5 billion US dollars. Between 19 and 22.5 compared to 59.5 billion, which the global north countries reported to OECD that they gave to developing countries for climate finance. Furthermore, globally, only about 20% of climate finance is dedicated to adaptation, despite a commitment in the Paris Agreement to achieve a balance between adaptation and mitigation. According to a report released by CARE International in 2021, actual disbursements for adaptation finance tend to be inflated by governments of the global north. In addition, adaptation finance is provided in concessional and increasingly non-concessional loans. So this basically means that the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world, who are predominantly BIPOC, are literally paying interest on the adaptation measures their countries are forced to implement. So when finance for adaptation, so even when the financing is available, right, it is often very difficult to access. The countries in most need of climate finance often lack the capacity and human resources to access it. These countries often lack adequate climate information and evidence, which to support the proposals that they make to international climate finance bodies. So they don't have the adequate data to actually back the proposals they make and make a case for why the projects they're applying for funds for are urgently needed. In addition, despite long-standing calls from both civil society organizations and countries in the global south, there is no specific mechanism dedicated to supporting efforts to address loss and damage in developing countries. This leaves vulnerable developing countries often forced to finance adaptation with loans from developed countries, thus paying for the cost of addressing loss and damage from domestic resources. So now let's just turn to development, a field in which I worked for close to 2 decades, and a field that is often used to support global south climate adaptation requirements and needs. So developing countries, as well as indigenous peoples and other communities, particularly vulnerable to climate change, have long been articulating what they need to address the impacts of climate change. Yet the needs of the most vulnerable and presently most affected countries, regions, and people remain unaddressed and unmet. This, I think, can be explained in part by the fact that development policies of donors are crafted at the headquarters of multilateral and bilateral development agencies based on what the developed countries' governments deem important, right? So as a result, donor interventions, which are often fragmented at best and sometimes competing, right, tend to prioritize physical infrastructure over social policy or social protection, for example. Even when projects are proposed by governments or local non-governmental NGOs, they are tailored to what donors will fund, because you're applying to, you already know the criteria by which they will use to determine whether they fund your project or not. So you're already crafting it in a way that the donors will understand and fund. So despite claims, top-down adaptation projects funded by donors to benefit local communities are often neither participatory nor democratic. So indigenous peoples and other marginalized groups are ignored at all levels of decision-making regularly. So the lack of engagement with unequal power relationships, so the lack of willingness to engage with this unequal power relationship, both in adaptation research and practice, can and does sometimes lead to adaptation interventions that do not benefit the poorest and most marginalized. In some cases, local communities even resort to blocking the implementation of adaptation measures as one of the very few tools available to those whose voices are not heard in the design of the policies and interventions that intimately affect their lives. So colonial continuities in this context materialize in the top-down approach adopted by UN organizations. Multilateral and bilateral organizations provide financial support for adaptation interventions while excluding marginalized groups in their design, their planning, and the implementation, often with complete disregard for the local social and political processes that produce specific distributions of vulnerability. So it's not just about addressing vulnerabilities, it's about understanding how they are produced. And this very often just falls by the wayside. So the influence of colonialism persists, in part because confronting them in international interventions creates discomfort. We actually heard this quite often when we were preparing the paper. Creates discomfort among researchers and practitioners. But of course, failing to confront the issue of climate diplomacy, so failing to confront colonialism and the fact that it still persists in neocolonial forms, it normalizes an environment in which the linkages between international development, which has its own sets of criticisms, climate policy, and racism as a root cause of vulnerability cannot be addressed. So as one scholar put it, unequal global power relations allow carbon neutral consumptions in the North to continue at the expense of high social and ecological in the global South. So the batteries of our electric cars and of other appliances that are multiplying in our digital age, which are often presented as reducing the ecological cost of transportation, they require rare minerals mined in countries in the global South with significant impacts on the health of local communities and their ecosystems. So let's talk about institutional racism within climate action. So often participation of BIPOC in the climate movement in the global North tends to be framed in terms of representation and inclusion more than in terms of leadership. So you all most likely know the story of the Ugandan climate activist, Vanessa Nakate, who was cropped out of photos depicting her and other young climate activists, all of whom, by the way, are not Black, at the World Economic Forum. In the summer of 2020, Tony Norshin, who was the only BIPOC activist protesting outside a coal plant in Germany among white activists, was removed from photos shared by Greenpeace Germany on its social media, for which the Greenpeace later acknowledged an error due to unconscious racism and white privilege. So the cropping of BIPOC activists from photos can be seen as a metaphorical crop out of BIPOC from the mainstream narratives of climate change and its solutions. As a result, the global climate crisis is being addressed without drawing upon the expertise of those most affected by it. So this can partly be explained by the fact that in the era of colonization, racist hierarchies constructed an image of African and indigenous peoples as intellectually inferior and irrational. This systemic stigmatization and related social inferiorization continue to be reflected in the ways in which knowledge and know-how of BIPOC population groups is assessed till today. So Western knowledge is considered as expertise, while the knowledge of indigenous peoples, which have been acquired and passed down often over centuries, as not expertise. Despite emerging discourse on the need to integrate Western science and indigenous people's knowledge, the different knowledge systems are still very rarely considered on an equal footing. So in countries in the global north, BIPOC communities experience greater pollution, environmental degradation, and climate change impacts than non-BIPOC communities, while having less access to healthcare. This amounts to a starkly racialized differential impact described as environmental racism. So for instance, in the US, BIPOC make up 57% of residents in a 2-mile radius of hazardous waste facilities. Moreover, institutional racism continues to shape domestic response to climate change, leaving BIPOC communities, so domestic response in the global north, leaving BIPOC communities both more vulnerable and exposed to the impacts of climate change. In the United States, racism has been found to influence the delivery of aid to Black households and communities in response to and in the aftermath of floods, forest fires, hurricanes, and other climate-induced disasters. Refugees and populations who have migrated to the global north from the global south represent racialized populations, groups that are likely to be disproportionately affected by climate change impacts in recipient countries because of unequal access to healthcare, social protection, and economic opportunities. So currently, the number of displaced people displaced by climate change, climate-related disasters was 18.8, so not currently, but in 2017, 18.8 million people. Although people displaced by disasters resort largely to internal migration today, so they mostly move just to nearby communities, not across borders. We can imagine that the number of people displaced by climate change impact is likely to increase substantially during the 21st century, resulting in most likely increased international migration flows. But then, nationalism is on the rise in the United States and in Europe. France on Sunday elected 10 times more members of the Rassemblement National, so the Front National party, into the French parliament than in the last elections. The number is now 89 compared to 6 in the previous elections. If this trend continues, we can imagine what life would be like for climate-induced migrants in that country. So research into the root causes of vulnerability in the global south, they show that structural factors such as historical patterns of underdevelopment, colonial histories, neocolonialism, and neoliberalism are core drivers of vulnerability. So in Mozambique, for example, the exclusion of ethnic minorities and communities in the design, development, and implementation of international climate adaptation finance and interventions have inadvertently supported the relocation of Mozambique's most politically and economically marginalized groups because the government has threatened military force and the withdrawal of basic services if they refuse to relocate. Basically, they're being forced to accept adaptation measures. However, the manner in which these socio-political effects of colonial legacy have shaped and continue to shape current vulnerability in the global south tend to be silenced and ignored in UNFCCC negotiation dynamics, as well as in international climate change research and policy. So, finally, I'm getting to the end. A 2018 systematic review and evaluation of 587 climate change vulnerability research articles reveals that existing publications, one, privilege climatic factors over social context. So the environment is changing. Two, neglects to analyze how vulnerability is produced and how it evolves over time. Three, ignore the existence of multiple perspectives. Four, downplay the understanding of cross-scale interactions, risking potential policy relevance, and or promoting the maladaptive practices, so practices that actually don't work. That it often downplays how community-level responses to climate change impact other communities, regions, or ecosystems directly or through feedback with larger level processes. So it's basically, there's hardly any feedback to understand enough about how vulnerabilities are created. Of course, right now, mostly in countries in the global south. So let's not end on a totally negative mode. Let's sort of think through a few ways that racism and neocolonialism in climate policy and action can be urgently addressed. So as I've detailed in the lecture, global climate governance continues to be steered by former colonial powers, right? So they're neither actively pursuing the 1.5 degrees target, which is what would actually make sense for the global south, and nor are they meeting their financial commitments to support adaptation, resilience building, and efforts to address loss and damage from the impacts of climate change. Meanwhile, BIPOC communities in the global north, as well as indigenous peoples and other racialized communities in the global south, are more affected by the climate crisis than other national communities. Before anything is done, we all need to pause and acknowledge the history and legacy of colonialism in climate policy and action, right? The dominance of the global north is tangible in interpersonal relations, multilateral and bilateral organizations, as well as in the climate movement through the design and financing of data-driven, technology-focused climate change projects to be implemented in the global south. It is also further seen, so the dominance of the global north is also further seen through the limited representation, the marginalization, and the tokenization of BIPOC in organizations tackling climate change. Institutional racism also materializes in the silencing or denial of racism by people working for BIPOC communities, both in the global north and the global south. So I think that eliminating racism in climate policy and action would require individual and institutional coordination of multi-level responses that would entail, one, like I said, acknowledging the history and legacy of colonialism in climate action and climate policy and action. Two, fostering a deep cultural change within institutions and organizations that are based in the global north. And we can do this by sort of questioning current inclusion practices in order to foster the actual, not just tokenization, the actual participation and engagement of diverse BIPOC. And we can also do this, so we can foster deep cultural change in the global north by also enforcing human rights obligations that countries have signed up to in international conventions that are attached to the United Nations. So another way of eliminating racism and neocolonialism in climate policy and action would require fostering solidarity and accountability through structural and institutional reforms with a focus on ending the global north's dominance in the global climate regime. This means taking up the issues, perspectives, and diverse worldviews into account and accepting multiple realities and ways of solving the climate crisis beyond the global north's perspective. Because the global north perspective is actually what got us into this mess in the first instance. The urgency in addressing racial and climate injustice jointly cannot be overemphasized. The global south and BIPOC people in general are not a monolith. They face challenges based on regional and context-specific power imbalances. Nevertheless, these groups cannot wait for the processes of overhauling the architecture of international organizations to unfold in a slow manner, while they continue to be tragically affected by climate change. If there was ever a time for an expedited process of transformation, the time is now. And I'm hoping that you all can be part of that transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We have collected some questions, and I'm really excited to ask them to you. So a first question is, what role do international treaties like the Paris Agreement or the Rio Air Summit play in achieving climate neutrality or even justice?
I mean, they're a good start, but they're not enough. I mean, they're a good start, but they're not enough. As I already noted in the talk, we're still looking at 2 degrees, right? And 2 degrees is way too hot for most parts of the world, especially tropical parts. So they are a good start, but they're definitely not enough. I mean, I was at Glasgow. I was in Glasgow last year for the COP26. I saw the discussions. I saw how they moved, but I also saw the limitations of such forums for pushing through a truly intergovernmental process among all the countries in the world, some of which are base their business model off of fossil fuels, for example, and that are not willing to let go of that for now. So one process that people have started thinking about is sort of how informal clubs like the G7 might be able to do something, right, about this, because it's a smaller number of countries. They all generally, even if they don't publicly acknowledge it, they all know that they're culpable for creating this mess. But maybe walking through them might offer if another way of approaching the issue. The Paris Agreement is still the thing that we're looking at, but we're also seeing the limitations of that by now.
Okay, thank you. And another question, has the German government ever been advised by the APRI?
On climate change, not yet, but we're working on it. We're working on it. Because look, things are pretty bad. Things are pretty bad. I think you all know this. Things are pretty bad. And unfortunately, I mean, I'm going to say what I said through the talk again. Unfortunately, the things are not being felt here as they have been felt in other parts of the world. I mean, we're feeling it, but we're not really feeling it, because, I mean, if Africa depends on rain-fed agriculture predominantly, right? Compared to any other region in the world, I think about 90% of agriculture in Africa is rain-fed. If you can't predict rainfall, you can't have proper agriculture, right? If you're having hurricanes way stronger, way more frequent than you're having before, it's hard to plan for that. I mean, the resources you have, you spend it on the one that happened now. You don't have the resources to deal with the ones coming. So we're really trying to look for ways of bringing perspective from that angle to say, we understand the need to mitigate. Mitigation is important because we absolutely have to do that. But for several parts of the world where there is no carbon emission, actually, really, I mean, in many parts of Africa, there really isn't much. It is adapting to that matter. So we're trying to come up with ideas that are coherent, ideas that actually kind of that draw from the experiences of those facing the crisis and present them to policymakers here.
Could you give us some examples for these ideas that you are coming up with?
Yeah, so we're about to start a project now that is going to be looking at 3 West African countries on locally led adaptation. So in other words, I mean, we keep hearing a lot about locally led adaptation. But we don't see enough examples of this, right? Because we often hear, and this feels to me like gaslighting. We often hear a lot that even if the money is available, right, what are they going to do with it? And that, I think, is a big problem. We can't, that's not a question that I want to answer at all, because just give the money first. Let's start with that. Let's start with giving the money. But okay, so if you want to have an answer to that question, let's look closer at what people are already doing to try and adapt to the climate emergency. So we're starting this project, which is going to look, first of all, at what the governments in 3 West African countries have on the books as adaptation policies, starting from their NDCs, right? And then going to other documents they have that are on adaptation, map that, understand what they're trying to achieve. And then after that, look at what people are already doing to adapt to the climate emergency on their own by themselves, because they're not waiting for policy to work for them. They are the ones facing, they're at the front line, so to speak. So what can we learn from this, and what ideas from them can be scaled? And even if not scaled, it's fine, because the solutions are not going to be the same across board. You're going to have different ideas come up that work in local communities. But to know them, acknowledge them, if they can be supported, to support them. So we're working on this, and hopefully by later this year or early next year, we're going to start having the first results that we can then present. So the idea, one, is to provide the recommendations based on these studies to African policymakers, because they are the ones dealing with this on their own. And some of them don't have the resources to actually do this research that we're going to be doing in the country, right? For obvious reasons. So providing them with, making the connection for them between the adaptation policies they have and actual locally led adaptation that is being implemented already by people in the country. But at the same time, also package that as things to talk to people in Germany at the EU level about that. Okay, this is what is going on in these countries. These are the things people are already doing. How do we support this in a way that is not reproducing this sort of colonial and neo-colonial power arrangements? Sort of listen and work with what is already there, instead of imposing things that sometimes are really well-meaning. I mean, I've been in the rooms where some of these things are designed from the global north. Are sometimes really well-meaning, and sometimes it's just, we have to spend money, so let's just do something. So, I mean, when we want to propose these ideas to the policymakers around here. So that's an example of the work that we're doing currently.
Thank you very much for giving an example. We have a question that maybe connects to this. What could this knowledge by BIPOC indigenous people help? How could the knowledge by BIPOC or indigenous people help with fighting the climate crisis? I mean, you already talked a little about it, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, part of the answer I already gave, but the other part is that some we don't even know, because we stopped looking, right? Some we don't even know what we don't have, right? Because we just assume that we know what to do, right? And so we just start doing it. And in a sense, we kind of do know some of the things to do, but we don't have enough view of the things to do. I mean, what's the human nature interaction that different communities have, and that people around here in Europe also used to have, that we've lost? What can we learn from that? And I mean, people are working on this. I know indigenous communities in the US are working on this, and I know people in some African countries are working on this as well. I mean, these are some of the things that we want to try and make popular too, because we are not, if we keep going the way we're going, and part of it is political, right? And part of it is, capitalism capture. If we keep going the way we're going, we can't make this. So why are we not looking for other ideas of how to make it work? I mean, maybe even ideas on how to organize ourselves in better democratic context. I don't know. So I can give an answer like, we have locally led adaptation strategies that we are not knowing, we don't access. But even beyond that, there are bodies of knowledge that we just don't even know whether we have, because we stop looking.
Thank you very much. Then there's a question. You talked about you being in Glasgow, and this is maybe it's a really personal question, so if you don't want to answer, we can understand it. But with what feeling did you leave COP26?
I spent a week there, and by my third day, by my fourth, fifth day, my thought was, so this is how we're going to fix this. This is it. This is the plan. But then afterwards, I talked to a few people who had been coming to earlier COPs. And so we started formulating a plan, because that's the way I kind of know how to work. If I don't know enough, I go study it. If I don't know what to do, then I start making a plan. So I started planning. So what do we need to do to at least provide bodies of knowledge that can start informing certain positions, or that can start making certain positions no longer tenable, right? What do we need to know? So, for example, for African group of negotiators, what do they need as resources to work with, so that when they're in the rooms negotiating, they have a better negotiating hand? What are the things that the governments in the global north need to be thinking about clearly and talking about, or that but they're not? So how do we pressure them to start doing that? So I left with a feeling like, okay, our job as APRI and as people working on climate change in and on behalf of the global south, our job is cut out for us. So let's start making alliances. Let's start looking for different ways that we can use to work on this. And that's also where the idea of the G7 and other clubs like this came up. Like, okay, so if this, if the UNFCCC process is absolutely needed, I'm very, very sure that it's needed, we need to have this negotiation happening at this level, and we need to constantly put people on the spot when we can about decisions they are making or not making in connection to that process. But if things are being slow on that end, are there other collections of countries, of actors that can move things a bit faster, right? So by January this year, I wrote an op-ed in the Tides for Germany's what Germany's relationship with Africa should be for the new government, climate diplomacy, and how that could work. So in APRI tomorrow, we're putting together an event on G7 and climate change, basically looking at what they've done in the past, the promises they've made are not fulfilled, but also the promises of what could be, right? We're discussing that tomorrow. So I left Glasgow not with the depression, but with the feeling like, okay, fine, I can't stay in this. I've got to find a way. We've got to find a way to work with other actors, APRI, other think tanks, other stakeholders on ideas that can push things a bit further. That was how I left Glasgow.
Thank you very much for your question. There's a question you talked about, if you don't know what to do, you make a plan or you look for the information and research. And we have a question here that is, I think, going in a direction like that. What is something what we as individual white listeners can do to support this process of addressing racism and climate policy and action?
That's a good question. I mean, part of it is supporting BIPOC sorts of communities and organizations, support them and listen to them. Listen to them, work with them, support them, and where possible, make sure that the action you're demanding isn't working counter the positions of BIPOC people, because that happens a lot. We have positions. So an example is this: the blanket ban. So when I was in Glasgow, when developed countries announced that they wouldn't fund fossil production outside of their countries anymore, and I thought to myself, so that's the problem, really? The problem is fossil fuel production in poor countries, in developing countries, not the consumption patterns in like our countries in Europe here. But my feeling is that part of why they did that was to give something to CSOs in Europe and in their countries to say that we've done something, right? But being able to point this out as hypocritical is extremely also important to support the type of positions, because yes, fossil should stop, but maybe we stop it here first, right? Maybe we stop it in the US first. Maybe we stop it in the countries that created the climate crisis first, and not in the countries. I mean, I just saw a story yesterday that even if Africa was to sort of do more gas to basically take care of people dying, because people are dying from not cooking with the wrong kinds of fuel, if Africa was to do that over, I think over till 2050, I think, the amount of what Africa is contributing as a continent for 54 countries is contributing to global emissions will not be more than 3.5% globally. Right? So again, we need to find ways to not contribute to the noise that will then end up in actions like that as something that the government here offer to CSOs as, we've done that, okay, so can we just stay quiet a bit longer and all that stuff?
Yeah, thank you very much. And what are some grassroots or some organizations that we could support and listen to? Do you have any examples?
I mean, we're currently, there's a spreadsheet actually that one of the people that I've collaborated with in Carnegie did. I can look for the link and send it to you, because it details all the organizations on the continent, at least all the ones that they can find, working on climate change and the topics that they work on. So those working on water, those working on agriculture, details all of that. And I think that's it. And where they have a website is there where they have. So those are a first sort of set to start with, because there's a list there to work with. And beyond that, my feeling is that there's going to be more and more people and organizations coming up working on this issue now. Part of the problem that I already pointed out when I was speaking is often the way we describe climate change, right, sometimes excludes certain people from becoming experts in climate change, right? So like if I go to many cities, many communities in Nigeria today, I grew up in Nigeria, I said earlier, and I say, I want a climate change expert, you probably wouldn't find a lot of people. But if you say you want an expert on agriculture, on adapting to the effects of climate change, which you can point out to agriculture, you find a lot of people like that. So, I mean, this is also part of the way of how we and others that we're working with are thinking about how to reframe what we're saying when we talk about climate change, how we communicate this, how we interact with people when we talk about climate change, how to be more inclusive in the terms we use, right? So that we actually have more people at the table and not just those who self-style themselves as climate experts or climate activists.
Thank you very much. That's also something really important I didn't know before. So that's good to know if I look for something in my research. And so we have one last question. Maybe it's also to end on a positive note. What, if there's anything, gives you hope whilst researching climate injustice?
For me, I'm beginning to see a much more united front among countries in the global south. I can mention the case of African countries. I mean, we're beginning to see a much more clarified position around, things like energy, which unfortunately is the difficult topic to actually have a conversation about. But I'm beginning to see that. I'm also hoping that we'll see more united fronts on some of these issues moving forward. And we're also seeing more ideas being thrown at the table on climate finance, on how to use SDRs, for example, how to use different ways to provide climate finance. So I'm seeing all of that, and I'm sort of slightly encouraged by that, because that means that people are seeing the urgency of it a bit stronger, and so they're responding by coming up with ideas. But my feeling is also that we don't have enough ideas at the table. But again, back to the optimistic side, but I'm seeing more and more ideas coming to the table, and we are working with others as well to come up with ideas. Not everything is going to work. Not maybe most are not going to work, at least not at scale, and that is fine. I'll close by saying that I'm a fan of science fiction, and maybe it's because I started following climate change that I'm a fan of science fiction. But one of the novels that touched me a lot in the recent past, I think the first time I read it was last year. I read it twice already. Is Ministry for the Future by I've forgotten the name of the author now. I've forgotten the name. Which basically sort of, I mean, it starts with a disaster, like a serious disaster, but it ends by showing that the adaptation strategies we need are local. The political organizations that will deliver to us these adaptation strategies are also local, because the things that work, I mean, we've lived through a very short period in which things appear to work the same way everywhere, right? But yes, thank you. Someone dropped a link in there by Kim Stanley Robinson. Yes, and the name there. We've lived in a period where things appeared, it didn't really do that, but appeared to work the same way everywhere. I mean, someone wrote a book called The End of History, right? But that's not going to sustain for long, because the crisis we're facing now is manifesting differently in different parts of the world. And so the way people respond to it are going to be different in different places. So that ties back to what I'm saying about the ideas of what we do. Many of them will not work in other parts of the world, to find a way to make them work better, popularize them, and maybe if they travel, let them travel. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for this presentation and the lecture. It was really interesting and we really enjoyed it. And we always have an after talk after the lecture. So if you still have time, we would be really happy if you could join us. And I think Cornelius will send you the link. And yeah, thank you everyone for listening. And we will see you next week.
Thank you very much.